1, go! Hairpin right. Very long, easy left.
You know, it's almost hard to believe that once upon a time, Sega was a giant in the gaming industry. If you visited an arcade back in the late 80s and 90s, chances are the most impressive thing you saw was a Sega game. From fighting games to shooters to racing games, it seemed like for a time they were untouchable. Amongst the numerous classics that Sega released in '94, Sega Rally was arguably the most groundbreaking. It wasn't just a huge commercial and critical success, it was a watershed moment for racing games. Before Sega Rally, rally games looked like this. And hey, I'm not knocking World Rally Championship. Actually, isometric racing games are my jam. I'm just pointing out the huge technical leap that Sega Rally was for the genre. And along with Sega's two previous 3D racing games, Virtua Racing and the relatively obscure cult favourite Daytona USA, Sega Rally helped usher in the 3D revolution. So successful was the original that almost 3 decades after it first hit arcades, its legacy can still be felt in the games we play today, and it's still possible to find arcade cabinets in the wild. The realistic physics, dynamic track surfaces, and cutting-edge visuals were a massive influence on the rally games that would follow, such as Colin McRae, which Codemasters cited as a key influence. And we'll come back to this because the two franchises would end up sharing more in common than you might think. Now, Sega Rally 2 would follow 4 years later and be equally well received, but due to the demise of arcades and a polarizing home port, the series took a break. We'd have to wait almost 7 years for another game, but in 2006 the franchise was resurrected as a late generation PS2 game. And this is where things start to get a bit confusing. Sega Rally 2006 was not only a PS2 exclusive, it only came out in Japan and Korea. At the time, Western audiences were like, what the fuck man, what about us? But they wouldn't have to wait long. A little over a year later, Sega Rally Revo, or just Sega Rally depending on where you live, came out for PS3, Xbox 360, PC and PSP. Now, why the two games were developed so close together by different studios is a mystery, but the delayed release of the 2006 game and the large Western audience on the newer machines may have been contributing factors. Revo is an interesting entry for several reasons, but probably the most curious of them is that it's essentially the last game in the franchise. Technically, Sega Rally 3 and Sega Rally Online Arcade came out after, but they're more like iterations of Revo than unique standalone titles. And seeing as we haven't had a new game since, or even a port of the earlier arcade titles to current hardware, many people blame Revo for killing the franchise. But I'm getting ahead of myself, we'll get to that. To start, let's look at how this game came to be.
90 right. Very long water splash.
Sega Rally Revo was the first game developed by Sega Racing Studio, or SRS, a British studio that pulled talent from studios such as Criterion Games and Codemasters. Their focus was simple, to create new racing games for Sega that would appeal to Western audiences. This would make Revo the first game in the series developed by a Western studio, with all previous entries being handled by Japanese developers. SRS was founded in 2005 and only produced 2 games before they closed their doors in 2008. The other game they made was Sega Rally 3 for the arcade, which was actually developed alongside Revo. Producing 2 very similar games was an attempt to capture both the arcade and home console markets. Revo has a championship mode, many more cars and things to unlock, while Sega Rally 3 maintains the short and sweet coin-op vibe the series is known for. The big innovation with Revo is track surface deformation. Sega Rally has always included different surfaces that change the way your car handles, but in this game, the cars themselves can alter the track surface. This effect isn't simply a gimmick, it's something that needs to be factored in. This is especially true on the muddy tracks or the tracks covered in snow, where the track surface evolves so much that each lap feels different from the last. To give you an idea of how dynamic the track surface is, according to a Eurogamer interview, the developers tested the deformation technology by setting up 6 AI cars to drive around a track for 12 hours. The end result was that they left behind a quarry. AI was another area that the development team focused on. Cars don't just stick to the racing line like they're on invisible rails like in previous entries. They're aggressive and they'll weave around you and dart up the inside to make a pass. Although it's an arcade racer, a lot of time was spent making it look as photorealistic as possible. SRS developed their own physics engine too, and included all the latest whiz-bang tech, such as realistic shadows, reflections, and high-resolution textures. Car models are incredibly detailed and based on real-life vehicles. To put things into perspective of just how much the visuals have improved since the first game, the original car models consist of 150 polygons, whereas Revo's cars are made up of 65,000. Studio head and former producer of the first 4 Colin McRae games, Guy Wilday, made a big deal about how next-gen the game's presentation is, and for 2007 it was a good-looking game. However, this came at a cost. Revo was capped at 30 frames per second on console, whereas every Sega Rally game that came before it runs at 60. Even the 2006 PS2 game runs at 60. When the game launched, reviews were generally positive. Critics praised the intuitive controls, colourful presentation, and arcade vibes. The criticisms were unanimous though. Things had changed in the racing space, and people wanted more depth, variety, and realism. Old school arcade style games weren't what people wanted back then, and even excellent innovative titles like Split Second and Blur, which released a couple of years later, would fail to find an audience. Rally games in particular had very much transitioned away from arcade races to more involved simulator style games such as WRC, Rally Evolved, and Colin McRae Dirt. Compared to these games, Revo lacks course length and variety. Games like Dirt also have weather effects and damage that not only looked cool, but is an integral part of the racing. Revo's impressive visuals and physics weren't enough. Its approach to racing was seen as antiquated, and even some glowing reviews couldn't save it. People just weren't interested in this style of game like they used to be. This wasn't SRS's fault, but unfortunately due to the poor commercial success of the game, they were sold off in 2008, and somewhat ironically acquired and merged into Codemasters.
3, 2.
I'm going to focus on the PS3 and 360 versions in this video, but I did want to quickly touch on the PC and PSP ports. The PC version runs at a weird 62 frames per second in the championship mode, which apparently causes some syncing issues. This is second-hand knowledge though, so feel free to correct me if this info is outdated. For whatever reason, the multiplayer can run as high as 120 frames per second. The PSP version of the game was handled by a different studio and is unsurprisingly quite different to better suit the hardware. The structure is the same in terms of cars and events, but the tracks are different and it has a unique control scheme. Anyway, getting back to the console releases, unlike the earlier arcade entries, Revo is set up like a typical console racer. The meat of the game is the championship mode. Like earlier entries, there's no story or cutscenes beyond the basic track intros. You compete in 3 race events, and the higher you place, the more points you earn. Completing events and earning points unlocks new vehicles, liveries, events, and tracks. Technically you can't fail an event, but you will need to reach a certain amount of points to progress to the next event. There are a total of 16 tracks to unlock, and they vary from lush tropical jungles to deserts to beaches to forests and even snowy regions. Each location has different track surfaces, and the game lets you choose between road and off-road tyres. Road tyres are less grippy on the off-road sections but provide better acceleration and top speed. Cars have unique performance and handling characteristics too, so it's worth playing around with this setting to see what works best for each car. Choosing manual transmission also affects performance, so if you're willing to learn the gear changes for specific corners, it's possible to have faster acceleration and significantly better mid-corner speed. This is almost required when you get to the final events because catching the leader requires near-perfect laps. There are 34 cars, with most of them needing to be unlocked. The selection of cars is a mixture of then-current WRC cars, classics, and just shit they thought would be cool. And yes, the Delta, Celica, and Stratos are all here. When you first jump into a race, the controls feel incredibly floaty, with your car sliding all over the place, almost as if the track is made of Teflon. This took me a moment to adjust to, but once you start to understand how much you need to countersteer and how much throttle you need to apply in the corners, it does begin to feel more intuitive. Using a pad, the stick feels a little too sensitive for making small adjustments, and sadly there aren't any options to adjust it, so if you have the option, I reckon a steering wheel would be a much better experience. Races are against 5 other cars, and unlike every other game in the series, which are loosely set up like real WRC events, each race starts with all 6 cars on a grid and you race them at the same time. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with this approach, but it is a pretty big departure from the rest of the games in the series, and I think it makes the racing feel more generic. While the time trial approach doesn't provide any real wheel-to-wheel action, because AI cars essentially act as time markers and don't really fight you, this format does separate it from other racing games. I know it isn't trying to be a simulation of the sport, but it is part of Sega Rally's DNA, and this change is one of the few things I don't like about Revo. All up, there are a ton of events, making it way more substantial than the arcade games, although it only takes a few hours to burn through the championship mode. Unlocking everything will take you a bit longer, but this is still a very short game when compared to something like Colin McRae. Now, it does have online multiplayer, and although lobbies are still technically functional, they're about as happening as a regional morgue. Thankfully, there is local head-to-head split screen for 2 players. It would have been awesome if you could race against AI cars in this mode as well, but at least you can still play multiplayer without a network connection. Despite this being a 7th gen title, and an early title for those systems at that, this is still a great looking game. The car models are a real standout of course, and driving through mud and water cakes them in dirt and dust, and it looks fantastic. The track design and the use of a bold colour palette has also meant that it still pops on modern displays. Games of this generation tended to be quite brown or grey, or brown and grey, and although Revo's presentation isn't timeless, I think it holds up a lot better than many other games from this period in time. The audio is impressive too. A lot of games from this era suffered from the hairdryer effect, where car engines sound more like low-powered grooming equipment. Revo, on the other hand, has throaty, angry, crackling engine sounds. The soundtrack is a throwback to earlier games with plenty of lively rock tracks that help connect it to its arcade roots. There are still signs of its age though. Screen tearing is pretty common, and 30 frames per second for a game as straightforward as this seems to indicate that the developers hadn't quite unlocked the full potential of the hardware. It's not a locked 30 frames per second either. The dips aren't massive and don't ruin the experience, but it's nowhere near as smooth as other Sega Rally games. I think it's fair to say that the poor sales is one of the primary factors as to why we haven't seen anything new from the franchise in over a decade. It's also likely, due to licensing, that these games are costly to maintain on digital stores. Both Revo and Sega Rally Online were delisted just a couple of years after release for licensing reasons. And while a handful of other classic Sega arcade titles like Daytona 2 and Fighting Vipers have found their way into the Yakuza games, it doesn't look like Sega has any immediate plans to give Sega Rally the same treatment. So you may as well give up on the idea of a next-gen reimagining of this series. Is probably what you thought I was going to say, but what if I told you that there is a new game currently in development being built in Unreal Engine 5 that's targeting all the major platforms? Well, that's exactly what Overjump Rally is. It's an unofficial love letter to the original 1994 game. It's a remake of the Forest stage along with both the iconic Lancia Delta and Toyota Celica. It's not a full remake unfortunately, there's only one stage, but it's shaping up really nicely, and it has a bunch of stuff that the original didn't. There's weather effects, a night mode, and you can wander around the event area to interact with things like a media station to check out replays. There's even talk of being able to play the Saturn version from within the game. There's no plans at this stage to recreate the full game, it's being positioned as a proof of concept, with the long-term goal of getting Sega's blessing. I don't think that's going to be easy, especially the part about playing the Saturn version, but it's fucking cool as shit and I really hope it happens. If you want to get behind this project, you can wishlist it on Steam, and I've dumped some info and links below the like button if you want to check it out.
2, 1, go! Easy left, easy right. 90 right. Road narrows. 90 right.
I don't think Revo is the best game in the franchise. Apart from the dynamic track surfaces, which are cool for sure, it doesn't do anything new or exciting. In fact, I think this is the most generic game in the franchise that in many ways fails to understand what made the earlier games so beloved. But, and this is a big but, in spite of these issues, I still think it's a great game. The fundamental feeling of Sega Rally remains intact, and throwing your car around the windy courses is exhilarating. The track design is some of the best in the series, and tied with Sega Rally 3, it's easily the prettiest game so far. If you've been hankering for more Sega Rally and are yet to give this one a go, you won't be disappointed.
Medium right.